Hey, so in this video, I thought it'd be fun to take a little trip down memory lane and have a look at a few of the most influential GPUs that I've used in my time as a PC gamer. This isn't from like an industry-wide perspective by any means, but rather just a look at the GPUs that have had the biggest impact on me personally. But first, this video is brought to you by VIP SCD Key. If you head over there using my link in the description box below, you'll find that they offer cheap OEM Windows 10 keys, for which you can use my discount code TPC, which gives you 25% off, bringing the price down to $17 US. And once activated, you'll be able to upgrade to Windows 11 for free. They also offer Office 2019, which you'll be able to get for only $51 US using the code TPC. So back to the video. So the first card that I want to take a look at was my first ever high-end GPU, the Matrix GTX 580 Platinum. Now this is a card that has seen a lot of hours of modded Skyrim. My memory of this GPU was that it was so huge and that it sagged in any build I installed it in, and that it was just really power hungry and ran extremely hot, like so much so that the fan stickers bubbled up and it heated my bedroom way past the point of comfort. But now that I look at it again after all these years, I find myself amazed by just how small it is. Like, maybe it's just that the 40 series had some huge cards, but I really did think my GTX 580 was bigger than this. It is a triple slot card. It's just not very long compared to the cards that we have now, as it only has 2 fans. This card cost me £385 back in 2011, and it's based on Nvidia's Fermi architecture, which both the 400 and 500 series cards used. The card has 1.5 gig of GDR5 memory, which was okay on its own, but is a really limiting factor if you try to SLI these, which I did, because I was an idiot back then. And still am now, let's be honest. So the next card is the Asus Mars 760. And this takes me back to an era when board partners were allowed to have fun, like there weren't so many rules. This card is actually 2 GTX 760s and SLI on one PCB, and it was marketed as a Titan killer, offering similar or better performance to the original GTX Titan, but at a lower price of £520, so long as the SLI scaled well in that particular title. But Nvidia would never allow for their market segmentation to be disrupted like that these days. They don't even allow board partners to make double VRAM cards like they used to back in the day. Unfortunately, Asus used that soft touch plastic, which I did really like at the time, but since then I've lost some peripherals over the years to the sticky deterioration it goes through, and you see it happening here, like it doesn't age well at all. The more you try and clean it, the worse it gets, and it's such a shame because I actually think this is still a really cool card design even to this day. So next is the GTX 970, which is an infamous card. I remember playing games with this on my 4K monitor and noticing some hitching in our frame rates when approaching the mid 3GB of VRAM usage, only to find out that only 3.5GB of the available VRAM ran at full speed, and not the full 4GB as advertised. I'm not smart enough to have ever conceived the cause behind the real-world performance that I was seeing at the time, but I did notice something was wrong, and I do wish I'd made some sort of content on it before the news had broke, because people never believe me when I tell them that I could tell something wasn't right. Especially as I believe Nvidia quickly updated the drivers to make it better at transitioning to the slower speed memory portion. This card makes my list of most influential GPUs, not because of the funny memory issue though, but because of just how many years I used it for. It's definitely been my longest serving card of my PC gaming life. And as you could get it for only around £240, it was also the cheapest card I'm looking at today. But as a result of having the 970 for so long, the next card on my list is the RTX 2080 Ti. Now this is a Founders Edition 2080 Ti, but it was the MSI Duke that I actually upgraded to and that I used and should be the one that's in this video. But it currently has a water block installed on it, so for ease of testing I just thought, I'd use the Founders Edition to represent this GPU. I think in the grand scheme of things, the RTX 2080 Ti is quite a forgettable flagship GPU, especially having followed the 1080 Ti, which was one of the best flagship GPUs ever made. Like, I'm quite sad that I never got to own one. The 2080 Ti was overpriced, and RTX was a feature set that you couldn't really use for a large amount of its reign, as there weren't any, or many, RTX games available. But the RTX 2080 Ti makes my list because it was a long-awaited upgrade after the GTX 970. It was the biggest leap in performance I'd ever seen in my own personal PC gaming history, and you don't forget a jump like that. And then finally, there's the GPU that I'm using now, the RTX 4080 GameRock OC. Much like with the 2080 Ti, this isn't a GPU that will go down in history as a fan favourite. It's far too expensive for the performance that you get in comparison to the flagship 4090, which is something that has been somewhat rectified with the new 4080 Super, which came with a price cut. However, as disappointing as this card looks on paper, I can't help but love it. Like, it's powerful enough to give me a great gaming experience, and my particular sample does so with no noticeable core whine, which seems to be rare these days. It's genuinely been an absolute joy to own. So this is quite a diverse selection of cards with a wide range of prices and specs, and therefore, there's not any real logical reason to be comparing them to each other. Except that I thought it would be fun. And at the very least, it allows me to see how far PC gaming has come since I first joined the hobby. But for the test system that I'm going to be using in this video, it features an Intel 13900K on a ROG Strix Z790i gaming motherboard with 32GB of DDR5 7200 memory. This does mean that the oldest cards here are combined with a CPU way outside of their era, but I just wanted to compare the GPUs with minimal system bottleneck or variables. I should add that any screen tearing you see is just due to how I'm recording. Usually I'd use VSync on older cards and variable refresh rate tech on newer cards, but it's better to have an uncapped frame rate for videos like this. So this card has dedicated voltage control buttons, and a 100% fan speed button. And I just think that's really cool. So I'm going to start with Grand Theft Auto 5, a game that was released in 2015 on PC. And this means that 3 of the 5 GPUs that I'm looking at were already released by the time that this game came out. The GTX 580 card works absolutely fine and doesn't appear to be in need of repasting, which is a surprise given how many years it's gone without use. The thing that surprised me the most about this card wasn't how bad everything looks. Like, as I drove around the city, I wasn't thinking about that. I was actually just in awe, like, how scalable PC gaming is. The consoles get well-deserved praise for giving developers a defined set of hardware to optimise games for, but the freedom you get with PC gaming hardware really has its own rewards. Like, here's an example of a game that will improve as you move through over a decade's worth of hardware, and you'll never need to buy the game again when you upgrade. So I targeted 1080p 60fps with my game settings, and it's the card's 1.5GB of VRAM that's the real limiting factor with the 580. There's a real juggling act trading off one setting for another, even though the GPU itself could manage more if it had more VRAM. Performance with these settings is fairly consistent, with only the occasional hitch. The visuals do give me real, console gaming vibes, in a way that's oddly nostalgic, as I stopped console gaming towards the end of the Xbox 360 era, and this looks like how I remember it being. The grassy areas, in particular, on the lowest graphical setting, stand out to me as particularly dated, as they obviously should. But overall, I'm impressed. As long as I don't look at any other display in my room, I could adapt to this. It wouldn't be as enjoyable as what I'm used to, but this is playable. So with the Mars 760, with the same settings, there is a noticeable increase in FPS, and the occasional stutter has now entirely disappeared. Having an extra 500 megabytes of VRAM doesn't make increasing the settings as easy as you'd think, because the jump from normal to high textures is too expensive. I opted to ignore the video memory limits this time and just see how it went, and within my short playtest I didn't notice any more stutters than I was getting on the 580, and I think the consistency trade-off is worth it for the improvement in textures. But the Mars 760 is a dual GPU, and so far I've been showing you the performance with only one of the two GTX 760s enabled. If I go into the NVIDIA control panel and turn on SLI and go back into GTA 5, you'll see that the frame rate pretty much doubles. And this is now a 1080p 120fps experience, which is amazing. Like, GTA always did have great SLI support. However, I would much rather have a better looking 60fps experience, and this is where one of the biggest issues with SLI makes its appearance. I've doubled my graphics horsepower, but I haven't really doubled my VRAM because that's not how SLI works. The in-game VRAM utilisation readout shows that I now have 4GB, but the usage estimation doubles as well. Even if I go through and turn up every setting that doesn't require more memory, I'm still at around 100fps, which gives me a 40 frames per second excess if I was synced on a 1080p 60Hz display. And I wish I could use that extra power for visuals instead. But upgrading to the GTX 970, I get an immediate sense of vindication over how much I champion 4K gaming. Like, the resolution upgrade adds a level of crispness to everything, and it's like a fog has been lifted, although only a fraction of this clarity will translate over YouTube. But for settings, I actually let GeForce Experience pick them, because GTA is one of those annoying games where you have to restart it every time you want to change some settings, and GTA is still such a slow game to load, even with an NVMe SSD. But I think GeForce Experience has done a great job here. I'm sitting comfortably in the 70s, which gives me the headroom needed for a very stable 60Hz VSync. The GTX 970 is such a huge step up over the previous two cards that I actually found myself forgetting that I was supposed to be testing GPUs and just kind of started playing the game instead. But moving up to the RTX 2080 Ti, I'm able to have the most meaningful settings at or either close to maximum. Surprisingly, I'd say this is a less noticeable jump in visuals than the jump to the 970 was, although this jump probably does translate better over YouTube. The RTX 2080 Ti was 3 to 4 times the price of the GTX 970 and is 2 generations newer, so you'd expect a huge leap here. But I think it's the age of GTA 5 and the fact that I was already in 4K that's giving me diminishing returns here. I may be using a modern GPU, but this is still a very old game, so there's only so far you can go with it. But where the 970 was barely capable of 4K gaming, the 2080 Ti is doing so comfortably. And then lastly, there's the RTX 4080, and at this point I can either turn some of the last remaining settings to maximum, which is what I chose to do, or I could have optimised things and gone for 4K in 120fps. At this point, this is GTA 5 pretty much mastered. And I'm not going to spend very long talking about this card because this video is supposed to be more of like a reflective look back at the older cards. So for the next game, I picked Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I've chosen to use the in-game benchmark to test the cards. With the GTX 580, I unchecked DirectX 12 in the launcher so that the game would run in DirectX 11 mode and set the game to its lowest graphical preset. And I'll let the results speak for themselves. Yeah, that's a pretty substantial graphical glitch. Running in 720p didn't help. The game did warn me to update my drivers, but Nvidia stopped supporting phone-based cards in 2018. With the Mars 760, claving renders correctly, which is great to see, and the GTX 760 is Kepler-based and had its last game-ready driver in 2021. With a single GTX 760 enabled, I've gone with 1080p, but with the resolution scale set to 70%, and this is just above 720p. And on the lowest graphical preset, it scores 52 FPS. Visually, the game kind of looks like a cartoon. It's crazy how different it looks on such low settings. So then I enabled the second GTX 760 with the same settings, and was disappointed to see that SLI doesn't work. The frame rate stays entirely the same. However, after a quick Google, it seems that you need to be in DirectX 12 mode to get the multi-GPU to work, and I was running in DirectX 11 mode because I thought that would be the best bet on the older cards. And the benchmark does actually run like this, and the frame rate does again pretty much double, but unfortunately there's a new graphical glitch, and this time it's flickering. I was able to get a playable frame rate with the graphics increased to the medium preset, but the flickering ruins things, so you'd be better off with a single GPU enabled. And this was the issue with the Mars 760. It was a Titan killer. but only when SLI worked. So upgrading to the GTX 970, unfortunately I'm still gaming in 1080p, but at least this time it's with the resolution scale set to 100% with medium settings and some much needed anti-aliasing, and this averages 60 FPS. Even ignoring the previous card's graphical glitches, this is a huge improvement going from lowest to medium settings. The difference is really night and day. And unlike in GTA 5, the jump to the 2080 Ti is transformative. Not only do I now have access to DLSS, I also have ray tracing. I decided to go with the highest preset, plus RT on Ultra. However, this does mean that I have to have DLSS set to performance mode, which is 1080p upscaled to 4K, in order to get a decent frame rate. DLSS still gets a lot of hate in the industry, but my theory is that most of that hate comes from people who either haven't tried it yet, or have tried it, but only on a lower resolution display where you already have a pixel deficiency to begin with. Like in 4K, there's rarely a reason not to be using some amount of DLSS at all times. And then lastly, with the 4080, I'm able to go with DLSS quality instead of DLSS performance, and I get an average frame rate well over 120 FPS. This upgrade here highlights where I think the industry is heading. Up until recently, a GPU upgrade would allow you to play in high settings instead of lower settings. And then as your GPU aged, you'd go from ultra to high to medium to low as you played newer and newer games, and the card struggled to keep up with the latest graphics. But I think instead, what we're going to see is the amount of upscaling change as a card begins to struggle. And then for the final game, I went with Remedy's Control. And to my surprise, the GTX 580 can play Control. But just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do something. I'm sorry, I'm really trying not to sound like a graphics snob in this video, but there's thousands of amazing older and retro games that you could play instead if you don't have, like, the latest and greatest tech. Like, please don't do this to Control, it doesn't deserve it. In terms of settings, this is a 1080p output but 720p render resolution. There's no DLSS to help me here. And then everything else is either off or on its absolute lowest settings. From a scientific curiosity, it is cool that it can run it at all, but I just can't get over how bad it looks. Like, maybe these settings would be okay on a handheld with a small screen, perhaps? Nope. With the Mars 760, there's still no SLI support at all, with Google only revealing some promising workarounds for newer cards than this, so I'm again stuck using a single GPU. A single GTX 760 though is still a noticeable performance upgrade over the GTX 580, which is enough for me to use the normal low settings preset, which adds SSAO, screen space reflections, and improves the texture somewhat compared to with the 580. But it doesn't allow me to increase the resolution or to get to medium settings. Upgrading to the GTX 970, there's a lot more performance here, but it's still not a big enough leap forward to allow for native 1080p gaming. Even GeForce Experience recommends 1366 by 768, and it simply looks like spud. I really wish I had nicer things to say, as according to the Steam hardware survey, 1 in 200 PC gamers are still using a GTX 970. Hopefully they're being used in esports titles that are less demanding than games like Control though. Moving up to the RTX 2080 Ti, and you finally have my permission to play Control. I'm joking, of course, please play games however you want, however you're able to, like, please don't let anyone gatekeep you out of playing games. But I do think that sometimes in discussions about games, people undervalue the importance of visuals. Like, people say how graphics don't change how fun games are to play, and will often state Nintendo games as an example of this, of like how visuals don't matter that much. But I very much disagree with this mentality. Like, how a game looks can make a huge difference to the narrative and your ability to get immersed in the world. And there is a whole lot more to games than just how fun they are to play. Just like with movies, games have the power to invoke a wide range of emotions, from joy to fear to sadness. Like, they are an art form, and I really think people do gaming a disservice when they dismiss visuals as being unimportant and just boil the whole experience down to how fun it is to play. The RTX 4080 allows you to play Control with the input resolution set to 1440p, so in other words DLSS quality, with the FPS in the 80s to 90s, and this is a fantastic gaming experience just as you'd expect. So I originally wanted to test just like a whole bunch of games in this video, but the truth is that games that really show off the capabilities and the differences between the newer cards are games that simply won't run the older cards, which is a shame, but to be expected. So the last thing I thought I'd do is run all 5 cards on an old school benchmark, 3D Mark's Firestrike. The GTX 580 has a graphics score of 4,876 points. The Mars 760 does 23% better with a score of 6,019, and turning on SLI gives a 94% performance increase compared to running a single GTX 760, making it score higher than the 970. And the 2080 Ti and 4080 are just in totally different leagues, with the 4080 being almost 12 times faster in this benchmark than my first ever high-end GPU. So that was a fun and interesting trip down memory lane, and these are my takeaways from this experience. The first is that not having enough VRAM can really hurt a card's longevity. This isn't anything new, but actually going back and trying to game on these cards, like you see firsthand just how it's not often the GPU horsepower that's holding you back, but rather the VRAM capacity. I have to wonder if Nvidia's strategy here is one of intentional planned obsolescence, since you do tend to get more VRAM from AMD's cards. And whilst I'm having a moan at Nvidia, my second takeaway is that GPUs used to be a lot more fun. The Mars 760 isn't the most practical of products, but it represents a level of engineering freedom that Asus had, which they no longer seem to. At an absolute minimum, I would like to see board partners given the ability to double the VRAM capacity of a GPU if they think there's enough demand to justify an additional SKU. And my last takeaway is that PC gaming and PC hardware just really is the best. Like, even if it's just for science, you can't try to play a modern game on an Xbox 360, but you can on a GPU that's as old as an Xbox 360. And I think that's just really cool. So yeah, if you like this video, please hit the like button. If you want to see more of my videos and haven't already, please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you to my incredible patrons, and thank you all so much for watching. Goodbye.